Hey guys, tonight we're going to step back in time to the early 19th century, where the air is crisp, the days are short, and the nights are long, especially for the American frontiersmen. These were the tough, resilient souls carving out homes on the frontier, and each winter they faced a brutal challenge: how to survive the cold, dark months with little more than their wits, their courage, and a few meager supplies. Winters on the frontier weren't just cold, they were life-threatening, stretching far longer than most modern comforts could ever prepare you for. Now, imagine yourself there, bundled up in heavy layers, sitting in the flickering light of a fire. The wind howls outside, and the temperature inside your cabin is barely above freezing. The landscape is a frozen white blanket stretching as far as the eye can see. You've prepared the best you could for this, but even the most seasoned frontiersman can't avoid the reality of a sleepless, lonely winter. You're in a small cabin, maybe just one room for you, your family, or your fellow settlers. The fire crackles away in the hearth, but it's not nearly enough to keep the cold from creeping in. The days seem to drag on endlessly. The isolation is overwhelming, and with the sun setting so early and rising so late, your body's sense of time gets completely thrown off. The air is so still, the world so silent, it feels like everything is holding its breath, including you. You might think, I'll get some rest now, the fire will keep me warm. But rest on the frontier wasn't exactly restful. It's one thing to sleep in your cozy, heated bed in the modern world. But imagine trying to find sleep while freezing in the dead of winter, surrounded by the haunting stillness of a world that seems to hold no promise of warmth or comfort. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from too, and what time it is in your neck of the woods, because, as we're about to see, time doesn't pass the same way on the frontier. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're about to dive into the trials of surviving sleepless winters on the American frontier, where the quiet could be deadly, the cold could be suffocating, and sleep, well, sleep was a luxury. Now that we're wrapped up in the thick of winter on the frontier, let's talk about sleep, or rather, the art of not sleeping. You see, winter wasn't just a test of physical endurance. It was a test of how little rest you could get and still make it to the next day. In fact, for many frontiersmen, sleep wasn't so much a luxury as it was a necessity snatched from the jaws of winter's fierce cold. And when you're talking about survival in such conditions, getting good, uninterrupted sleep was almost a mirage. Think about it. Imagine the struggle of getting cozy under thick furs or blankets while the wind howls and the temperature drops to levels that make your breath fog in front of your face. The fire in the hearth might warm you, but it doesn't reach the tips of your fingers and toes, which are chilled no matter how many layers you wear. Sleep, then, becomes a tricky thing to navigate. Your body wants to rest, but your mind is wired, thinking about the next task, the next meal, or whether that soft creak you hear outside is a prowling wolf or a neighbor's tired horse. You've probably heard of those long sleepless nights, where the world outside is as dark and silent as the inside of your cabin, and sleep just doesn't come easily. Frontiersmen didn't have the luxury of modern blankets or fancy heating. The cold that wrapped around their cabins was relentless, and it never really let up. Sleep cycles? They didn't really exist. You just slept when you could and stayed awake when you had to. And as you toss and turn in the freezing cold, you're reminded that comfort was a foreign concept in these conditions. You doze off, but it's not a peaceful, deep sleep. It's more like a half sleep, in and out, half awake, half numb to the world around you. But what makes this even harder is the lack of light. The days are short. The sun sets by 4 p.m. and doesn't rise until 7 a.m., which throws off your natural circadian rhythm. Without the sun, there's no sense of what's normal. Your body isn't sure if it should be awake or asleep. The darkness becomes a persistent companion, making it harder to feel fully rested. Historians still argue whether frontiersmen ever really adapted to the long nights, or if they were constantly fighting off exhaustion from their erratic sleep schedules. When the snow piles up outside, you might find yourself lying awake, waiting for morning light to bring you a sense of time, a sense of normalcy. You're not just sleeping, you're barely surviving each night, fighting against the weight of cold and isolation. It's a strange feeling, almost like you're half dreaming. Your body wants to sleep, but you know that tomorrow's tasks are looming large. And if you're the type to hear every creak in the night, whether it's the wood settling, a distant animal, or the wind pressing against your cabin walls, sleep becomes even more elusive. So, despite how much you need it, sleep becomes something you chase. You never really catch it fully. It's something that eases into your body only when it can, never all at once, always interrupted. But even a little rest is better than none. And in the dead of winter, when every muscle aches from the cold and your mind can't quite shake off the weight of the isolation, even a half hour of shut-eye feels like a small victory. As you rest tonight, imagine being back there, tucked under those furs, in the quiet of the frontier, where sleep wasn't so much about comfort, but about finding peace despite the relentless challenges of winter. There's something oddly reassuring about how sleep, despite all odds, can still find a way into your body, even when everything around you seems to scream that it shouldn't. As the winter stretches on and you're still navigating this strange rhythm of restless nights and brief moments of sleep, you start to notice something. It's not just the cold that's wearing you down, but the isolation. The frontier, especially in the middle of winter, is quiet, eerily quiet. The wind howls, the trees creak, and the occasional distant howl from a coyote is the only sound that breaks the silence. It's easy to imagine how, with this constant solitude and the lack of daily interaction, your mind can start to play tricks on you. And it does. Sleep during this time isn't just about shutting your eyes and catching up on rest. For many frontiersmen, it's also about mental survival. Isolation is a serious problem when you're stuck in a tiny cabin, alone or with just a few companions, for days on end. The silence outside your walls can make even the most calm person feel like they're losing touch with reality. But there's something about the lack of daily routines that hits harder when you're out on the frontier. When the sun rises so late and sets so early, and there are only a few hours of light to get everything done, sleep patterns get pushed aside. You might end up just working or sitting in the quiet, trying to pass the time, all while your body and mind beg for rest. The lack of social interaction adds another layer to this. You're not just tired, you're lonely too. When you're spending so much time alone or with only a small group of people, you begin to realize how much we rely on conversation and interaction to mark the passage of time. With long winter nights ahead, there's not much else to do but either work or sit quietly in the dim firelight, thinking about the future or, more likely, the past. And while this may seem peaceful to an outsider, it can start to feel like mental torture. This is where the struggle to sleep intensifies. Your body might want to rest, but your mind is running. Your muscles ache from the cold. Your eyes feel heavy, but your brain just won't shut off. This constant state of half sleep becomes the new normal. You're drifting in and out of slumber, but each time you stir, there's a feeling of not quite being there. Your dreams might be vivid, strange, or even haunting, because in the silence of winter, your mind is searching for something to cling to. To cope with this mental strain, frontiersmen develop clever strategies, some of them practical, others a little quirky. Historians still debate how much mental distraction was needed to keep a person sane through the months of isolation. Some would read books or journals, others would spend their time carving or mending tools. Even storytelling played a big role. The simplest conversations or shared stories would become treasured moments, breaking up the endless quiet. But for many, these moments were fleeting, and once they were gone, the real challenge was battling your own mind as much as the cold. Sleep wasn't just a matter of being physically tired, it was also a fight against the creeping feeling of boredom and mental fatigue. It's easy to see how, after weeks of the same routine, endless dark nights, brief snatches of daylight, and little social interaction, the stress of loneliness could begin to erode even the most steadfast frontiersman's resolve. Some of them, especially those farthest from other settlements, would go days without speaking to anyone. No wonder sleep wasn't just about laying down at night. It was a mental exercise to escape the quiet and allow your mind to relax into rest. But here's the strange part. Despite all of this, sleep still had its rewards. Maybe it wasn't always deep, restful sleep, but even in the quietest moments, sleep brought a break from the harshness of the world. It gave the mind a temporary escape from the emptiness of the endless cold. And for those brave enough to face it, the return of spring and the easing of winter's grip felt all the more like a triumph. So, as you settle down tonight, imagine the simple yet powerful relief that would come from sleep on the frontier. It wasn't just about shutting your eyes. It was a moment of peace, a brief reprieve from the silence, the cold, and the grind of daily life. Even though sleep might have been elusive, it was still something to look forward to, a necessary part of survival that allowed you to reset for the struggles ahead. As you spend more time on the frontier, the brutal reality of winter becomes harder to ignore. It's not just the biting cold and the never-ending darkness, but also the overwhelming physical demands that weigh heavily on both your body and mind. Every day feels like an endurance test, and as much as you crave a full night's rest, winter's tasks leave little time for anything more than fragmented sleep. Your body aches, your bones feel stiff, and your muscles protest each time you move. But here's the thing. Even though you're physically exhausted, the work is never done. The fire needs to be stoked, the animals fed, and the cabin maintained, all of which demands your attention no matter how little sleep you've gotten. The problem isn't just the quantity of sleep, it's the quality. Even if you manage to fall asleep, you're constantly jolted awake by the cold or the strange sounds from the forest outside. The wind howls relentlessly, rattling the windows and creating an eerie atmosphere. If you're alone, The silence becomes even more unsettling. Every rustle in the woods, every snap of a twig seems amplified, like the frontier is holding its breath, waiting to reveal its dangers. It's this anxiety that often prevents a deep, peaceful sleep. You find yourself waking up in the middle of the night, your heart racing, listening for signs of wolves, bears, or, worse, humans. Even the bravest souls couldn't entirely shake the feeling that danger was always lurking just beyond the glow of the firelight. When you do manage to get some rest, it's usually in short bursts. You might close your eyes for a few hours, only to wake up a few moments later, feeling disoriented. Your body wants to rest, but your mind keeps you alert, constantly scanning for threats. Sometimes you doze off, only to be startled awake by the sudden realization that you've missed something important. Maybe it was the crackling of the fire dying down, or the wind shifting in a way that suggested a storm was coming. There was always a part of you that couldn't quite let go, a part that was perpetually on guard. So, instead of experiencing the kind of sleep that allows for complete recovery, you end up stuck in a state of half consciousness, always ready to jump back into action. But despite the sleeplessness, there's a strange resilience that comes with life on the frontier. Over time, your body adjusts. You start to sleep a little bit less, and you begin to notice how your senses become sharper in the cold, dark nights. Adaptation becomes second nature, whether it's your body finding a way to sleep in short intervals or learning to rely on mental endurance to power through the fatigue. You might even start to get used to the cold, to the point where you no longer wake up at the slightest chill in the air. The winter routine becomes familiar, like a strange, never ending cycle that your body and mind fall into without much thought. And before long, sleep on the frontier feels less like a luxury and more like a simple act of survival, a brief reprieve before another day of hard labor begins. The truly remarkable thing is that even in these extreme conditions, sleep still holds value. It's the one thing that keeps you going, even when everything else around you seems to be trying to wear you down. It's the moment when you can briefly escape the constant grind of survival and recharge your body for another day. Historians still debate whether sleep deprivation during the long winters of the frontier was sustainable, or if it had lasting health effects. Some argue that the constant disruption of sleep led to chronic exhaustion, while others suggest that the mental strength required to endure such conditions helped frontiersmen develop an almost supernatural resilience. Whatever the case, sleep was undeniably crucial to their survival, no matter how fragmented or interrupted it was. Tonight, as you sink into your own bed, think about how sleep was a precious commodity on the frontier. The long nights, the cold, the constant vigilance. These are things most of us would never even think about in our modern heated homes. But for the frontiersmen, sleep was both a challenge and a blessing, something to be earned no matter how elusive it might be. As winter deepens, a new challenge emerges for the frontiersmen: the scarcity of food. The long months of isolation lead to dwindling supplies, and as much as you want to hunker down and sleep, your stomach is a constant reminder that rest is hard to come by when you're hungry. There's a fine balance between conserving what you have and making sure you don't eat too much too soon. You know that the longer the winter lasts, the harder it will be to make those rations last until the thaw. But what happens when the hunger pangs keep you awake, gnawing at your insides through the long, silent nights? The reality of winter survival wasn't just about staying warm or keeping busy. It was about making the food last. Frontiersmen had to rely on what little they could hunt, trap, or trade for. The bounty of harvest past quickly dwindled, and the land outside, beautiful as it may have been in its stark winter splendor, wasn't going to give up much. Sure, you could hunt for deer or rabbit, but hunting in the winter was treacherous. The cold made tracking harder, and snow could easily cover your footprints. The frozen landscape also made it harder for animals to move around, meaning they were far less likely to wander into your traps. So, food became scarce, and with scarcity came a dangerous cycle. Less food meant less energy to work, which led to more hunger and eventually sleep deprivation. The strange thing about hunger is how it messes with your ability to sleep. Imagine the pain in your stomach as you lie there, wide awake, eyes fixed on the flickering fire. Hunger can feel like a constant companion, not only keeping you from getting the deep rest you desperately need, but also becoming a loud distraction. It's like your body has two missions: stay warm enough to survive and sleep enough to function, but hunger can make both of those harder. You may wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding from a bad dream or a sudden chill, only to find that hunger is still there, gnawing away. How do you rest with that discomfort? How do you sleep when your body is constantly demanding food, yet there's hardly any left? It wasn't uncommon for frontiersmen to eat less and sleep less as the months dragged on. They had no choice but to adjust to the grumbling emptiness, trying to ignore it for as long as possible, hoping the hunger would just fade away. But it didn't. Sleep, when it did come, was often interrupted by dreams of food, dreams of feasts and banquets that seemed tantalizingly out of reach. In the worst cases, you might even find yourself waking up hungry, only to realize that your dreams of food were just that, dreams. What makes this even more difficult is the toll hunger takes on your mind. Fatigue and hunger are a dangerous combination. The less you sleep, the less energy you have. The less you eat, the more your body becomes worn down, and soon your ability to think clearly diminishes. It's hard to feel rested when your body isn't getting what it needs, and it's even harder to stay alert if your mind is consumed by thoughts of survival. You start to notice the toll on your emotional state. Maybe irritability sets in. Maybe you become sullen or withdrawn. Loneliness, combined with hunger and fatigue, makes the days stretch on forever. In these moments, sleep feels like a brief escape from the cruel reality of winter life. Interestingly, it was during this difficult time that frontiersmen developed some odd survival tactics, sometimes creative, sometimes just plain quirky. Boiling bones for broth became an essential practice. Even though it might not have been much to fill you up, it kept the hunger at bay, gave you some warmth, and, oddly enough, helped bring a sense of comfort. It wasn't a real meal, but it was something to stave off the worst of the hunger pangs. These little rituals kept the mind occupied and helped frontiersmen power through the cold, isolated nights, hoping for spring. Even when food was scarce, sleep was essential. But it's easy to see how, in the direst of times, sleep becomes less about comfort and more about restoring strength for another grueling day of survival. The hunger would eventually pass, if only for a few hours, but the sleep deprivation remained a constant challenge. As you lay down tonight, consider the strange relationship between sleep and hunger. For most of us, hunger is something we feel when we're awake, a signal to find food. But imagine a life where hunger isn't just about finding dinner. It's something that gnaws at you while you're trying to sleep. Tonight, as you find comfort in your own bed, remember the frontiersmen who faced not only the cold but the quiet agony of hunger, battling to survive each day and each night against the harshness of the frontier. The winter days seem to stretch on endlessly. By now, you've probably become accustomed to the rhythm of living on the frontier: sleep in small bursts, the unforgiving cold, and the nagging hunger that never quite disappears. But there's something even more pressing in this endless cycle of survival: night watch. You see, it wasn't just the isolation, the hunger, or the cold that kept you awake at night. It was the constant need to stay alert, especially when darkness fell. Out on the frontier, especially during the harsh winter months, your cabin wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a fortress. And when you're living in a place where wildlife roams freely and human threats aren't unheard of, the need to keep watch becomes a reality you can't ignore. The long winter nights were particularly treacherous because, without the distractions of daylight, the silence of the world outside could easily make you feel vulnerable. Even the slightest rustle or snap of a branch could set your heart racing. That's when the dread of nighttime creeps in. In the dead of winter, when you're trying to rest and regain your strength, you're not only struggling against your body's tiredness, but also against the instinct to remain vigilant. The cold, the isolation, the creeping anxiety, it all forces you to stay awake, even when your body demands rest. It's an uncomfortable situation to be in. You might lay there, eyes half shut, your body aching from hunger and fatigue, but your ears straining to catch every small sound that might signal danger. The crackling of the fire could easily become a source of comfort, or it might start to sound like something more sinister, like a signal that something or someone is out there, waiting. This vigilance, this constant alertness, doesn't just disrupt your sleep patterns, it alters how you experience rest. You never truly rest when you're on edge. Even when you do manage to fall asleep, it's not a peaceful slumber. It's a state of half awareness, constantly aware of your surroundings. You might even wake up after a few hours, your senses heightened, thinking you heard something. Maybe it's just the wind. Maybe it's your imagination. But either way, the sleep you do get is fragmented at best. The responsibility of keeping watch wasn't just about staying safe. It was about maintaining a sense of control over your environment. In such a volatile and unpredictable world, sleep, when it came, became a luxury and a sacrifice. If you were alone, this task could feel even more daunting. But even in a cabin shared with others, the need to take shifts was inevitable. You'd sleep for a while, but then you'd have to wake up, shake off the drowsiness, and take over the night watch for the next person. Sometimes, if you were lucky, you'd get a bit of peaceful sleep before the cold drove you awake again. You might rest your head on a rough pillow made from furs or maybe a makeshift bag filled with straw. The flickering light of the fire would provide some comfort, but you'd always be aware of how vulnerable you were, especially when you knew you couldn't afford to be careless. But the thing about winter nights on the frontier is that they're long. They seem to stretch on forever, especially when you're watching the fire and waiting for dawn. It's not like the quick, peaceful nights you might imagine in the safety of a cozy, modern home. Here, every night felt like it could be a battle, with your sleep constantly interrupted by your own alertness. The frontiersmen didn't get the kind of rest that we might expect after a long day's work. Instead, they'd often get just enough to keep their bodies going until they could get another little burst of sleep, maybe just a couple of hours here and there. Historians still debate whether this sleep deprivation was sustainable or whether it took a lasting toll on the health of frontiersmen. Some argue that the physical demands of surviving on the frontier actually helped harden the body to the effects of sleeplessness, while others point out that this constant vigilance and erratic sleep likely had lasting mental health effects. Whatever the case, the night watch became a way of life on the frontier, a reminder that sleep wasn't just a rest from the day's labor, but a battle to be fought every single night. So, tonight, as you settle in, think about the frontiersmen who fought for those brief, interrupted moments of sleep. Imagine how your senses would have been on high alert, always expecting the unexpected. You might be lying in your cozy bed, but their struggle for rest during those long winter nights wasn't just about comfort. It was about staying alive, one restless hour at a time. As winter trudges on, the freezing winds howl outside, and the seemingly endless stretch of cold continues to drain every ounce of energy from your body. The nights, once filled with discomfort and the biting cold, now seem to stretch on without end. Yet, even amidst all this hardship, there's something else weighing heavily on you: loneliness. The frontier, especially during these harsh months, can feel overwhelmingly isolating. Even though you might be surrounded by a few fellow settlers, the loneliness can still be suffocating. Without the social interactions of town life, you start to feel disconnected from the world, and that sense of isolation becomes both a physical and mental burden. It's one thing to endure physical cold, it's another entirely to endure the mental strain of prolonged solitude. This isolation plays a significant role in your sleep, or rather, the lack of it. When you're constantly alone in the stillness of winter, even the quiet moments that usually bring comfort become troubling. In fact, it's these long, silent nights when your thoughts wander to darker places, and it's harder to turn your mind off to sleep. It's no wonder that many frontiersmen experienced the infamous cabin fever. The mind, left to stew in isolation, becomes overwhelmed with thoughts of homesickness, fear of the unknown, and worry over whether you'll survive the harsh months ahead. You've probably noticed that sleeping in silence can sometimes feel unsettling. For these frontiersmen, the silence of the wilderness, broken only by the occasional coyote's howl or the crackling of the fire, would have been unbearable after weeks of isolation. The weight of unspoken thoughts hung in the air, thoughts that weren't just about the day-to-day survival, but about the mental toll of living alone, often with little contact from others. As night falls, it's not just the cold or hunger that keeps you awake, but the thoughts of being disconnected from the world. The lack of conversation and interaction amplifies the effects of sleep deprivation. Your mind is working overtime, keeping you awake with worries about the future, about survival, and whether the next day's food or firewood supply will be enough. It's this mental fatigue that plays a huge role in the poor quality of sleep. And let's face it, sleeping in a small, dimly lit cabin with just a few people for company doesn't provide the comforting distraction that socializing or even casual conversation would. The silence gets louder and more oppressive by the hour, and yet, even in this isolation, sleep becomes a necessity. Your body craves it more than ever, but it's constantly interrupted by the discomforts of the night. The cold air seeping through cracks in the walls, the hunger that gnaws at your stomach, and the weight of loneliness that keeps you restless. The unfortunate paradox is that the desire for sleep is often stifled by the very mental strain that makes rest essential. Interestingly, some frontiersmen relied on mental distractions to push past the loneliness and find moments of rest. Storytelling, often around the fire, was an essential method of coping with isolation. Even though there weren't many to talk to, a single tale could offer the illusion of companionship. Stories of faraway places or heroic deeds would temporarily take your mind off the endless winter night. But even so, it's hard to ignore the toll loneliness takes on your rest. Without the opportunity to talk through your day or share a laugh, your mind remains stuck in an echo chamber of thoughts, looping endlessly. Historians still argue about the impact of this mental isolation. Some suggest that the silence and solitude led to significant emotional distress and contributed to the wear and tear on the body, while others argue that the quiet allowed for mental clarity and focus in a way that was necessary for survival. Either way, there's no denying that the combination of loneliness, hunger, and cold made sleep difficult, as your body and mind were constantly battling to hold on to a sense of normalcy. So, as you lay down tonight, consider the frontiersman on that long winter night, alone in his cabin, fighting off the gnawing hunger and the biting cold, yet still needing to sleep to face the next day. Imagine the battle between your need for rest and the pressure of being alone with your thoughts. Loneliness, much like the cold, becomes something you must endure, not just physically, but emotionally. Sleep in these moments becomes the sanctuary you desperately need, but it's a sanctuary you must fight for. As winter drags on, the struggle for rest intensifies, especially as you realize that it's not just your body you're trying to repair. Your mind is at its limit too. The mental fatigue of isolation, constant vigilance, and physical labor begins to take its toll. Even if you're lucky enough to have a few companions in your cabin, the lack of distractions makes sleeping in shifts a common practice, a way to keep at least one person on alert at all times, while others catch whatever sleep they can. But that creates a new issue. Sleep isn't just fragmented, it's shared. You find yourself in a strange routine where rest becomes less about comfort and more about compromise. Imagine sleeping next to someone who also has to get their rest and knowing that their sleep schedule could be your own moment of wakefulness. You're already dealing with restless nights, but add to that the pressure of being responsible for someone else's safety during the night, and it becomes harder to let go and fall into a deep sleep. Sleeping in shifts wasn't just about keeping watch, it was a survival tactic. The frontiersmen understood that safety didn't stop just because the sun went down. If your cabin was surrounded by wilderness with potential dangers lurking in the darkness, you needed to stay alert even when you were exhausted. At times, it was impossible to fully relax your muscles, knowing that a dangerous animal or a stray trapper could wander too close. There were always dangers in the dark, and the quiet of the wilderness only heightened those fears. So, someone had to be awake, watching, listening, ensuring that nothing could sneak up on you while the others slept. Historians often debate whether this method of sleeping in shifts led to better overall survival or if it simply stretched the fatigue further. On one hand, it meant that everyone got a chance to rest, but on the other, It meant that no one ever truly got a full night's sleep. Your body might have gotten a few hours here and there, but it wasn't the kind of restful sleep that allowed you to fully recover. When you're always listening for sounds, always aware of the shifting wind or an animal's footsteps, even the best sleep feels like it's always just beyond your reach. The worst part about sleeping in shifts, though, was the lack of consistency. There was no predictable rhythm to your rest. You might sleep for a few hours, only to be woken in the dead of the night for your turn to keep watch. By morning, you felt groggy and disoriented, but there was always more work to be done. Maybe you were gathering firewood, hunting for food, or making repairs. Even in the harshest of winters, the daily tasks couldn't stop. You had to keep going, even if your body and mind screamed for rest. That meant that sleep, when it did come, was nothing like the peaceful slumber you might imagine. It was broken up, interrupted by the constant demand for vigilance. It wasn't just a lack of comfort, it was a lack of control. Sleep, which should have been a reprieve, became another battle, one where your body tried to find peace while your mind fought to stay awake just in case something went wrong. The inability to control when or how you slept took away a small piece of your autonomy, leaving you with nothing but a sense of being constantly on alert. The nights seemed to drag on forever, each hour a delicate balance between getting some rest and staying safe. But through it all, sleep became a precious resource. Every hour you managed to get felt like a gift. And when your shift was finally over and you could rest, even in the roughest conditions, there was a feeling of temporary relief. For those brief moments, you could finally let your guard down, even if you knew that the battle to survive wasn't over. Tomorrow would bring more hardships, more cold, more work. But for now, sleep offered you a chance to recharge, to gather the strength needed to face another day. As you lay down tonight, think about the frontiersmen who slept in shifts, how every tiny bit of rest was valued, how sleep wasn't just a break from the day but a survival tool. Imagine what it was like to fight for that rest, to share your cabin with others who, like you, were just trying to survive. Sleep in those moments wasn't something you took for granted. It was a precious commodity, one that, even in the harshest of winters, you had to share and protect. As the long winter months press on and the days start to blend into one another, the idea of survival becomes increasingly centered around routines, especially when it comes to how the frontiersmen adapted to the lack of sunlight. With the sun barely appearing above the horizon for most of the day, and the cold wind constantly battering against your cabin, the rhythm of sleep naturally follows the natural world cycles. The problem? Daylight is now a fleeting luxury. You sleep when you can, but without the natural cues you'd normally rely on to tell you when to wake up or go to sleep, everything starts to blur. Your body becomes increasingly disconnected from the usual markers of time. So, how does a person cope with living in a place where the day is shorter than the night and the world outside never stops being a frozen wasteland? The answer lies in adapting to the mental and physical strain of living by a new kind of clock, one governed not by the sun's movements, but by sheer survival instinct. You start to adjust to the fact that time doesn't pass in the same way. Sleep is no longer dictated by the usual rhythm of waking up with the sun. Instead, it becomes something you have to fit into the pockets of your day, like the few hours of warmth you get from the fire, or the quick bursts of work in between your restless periods of rest. In these dark, snowy months, you find yourself waking not because the sun tells you it's time to rise, but because your body knows it has to keep moving to survive. Even when you're exhausted, even when the cold seeps into your bones, you still feel that little voice pushing you out of bed. It's not a voice that says, "Get up, it's time for work." It's a voice that says, "Get up, or you'll fall behind." The need to keep moving, to keep surviving, pulls you out of your restless slumber and into the next day. But as you continue this grueling cycle, you begin to understand something profound. Sleep, in its purest form, becomes a luxury you can't always afford. When you're battling the elements, worried about how much food you have left, or trying to keep your cabin standing against the weight of snow, sleep often has to take a back seat. It's a secondary concern to the physical survival of the body. When you're constantly battling to stay warm and ensure you're not freezing to death, sleep doesn't have the same appeal it once did. It becomes a commodity, a necessary escape from the daily grind, but one that you can never quite settle into fully. However, you do what you can to keep sleep manageable. Candlelight and the soft glow of the hearth become the only comforts you have. If you're lucky enough to have family or fellow settlers sharing the space, sleep becomes a communal experience. The warmth of bodies gathered close together, trying to stay as warm as possible, becomes a source of comfort. But even with the shared warmth, sleep is never completely undisturbed. There's always a part of you that remains alert, listening for the wind or for the distant sounds of animals, always waiting for the next challenge. Interestingly, despite these constant interruptions, sleep still has an irreplaceable role in the daily life of a frontiersman. No matter how fragmented it becomes, sleep is still the body's way of resetting, even if it's just for a few hours at a time. When you do manage to rest, it feels as though you've earned it. The need for sleep doesn't disappear, even in the worst of times. It becomes something more precious, something to be cherished and earned. Historians still debate whether frontiersmen were able to maintain their health and mental clarity through the long, sleepless winters. Some argue that this kind of sleep deprivation had long-lasting impacts on both their physical well-being and their ability to cope with the harshness of their environment. Others suggest that the resilience of these settlers, shaped by generations of hardship, meant they were more capable of enduring these conditions. Regardless, there's no doubt that the lack of sleep, compounded by isolation and stress, made life on the frontier a constant battle against exhaustion, both physical and mental. So, as you prepare to sleep tonight, think about the settlers who endured the harshest winters when time itself seemed to freeze. For them, sleep was something to be earned through hard work and vigilance, something that didn't come easily but was always appreciated when it did. Tonight, when you lay down in your warm, quiet bed, think about the resilience that kept them going, even through the longest, darkest winters. As the days drag on and the unrelenting cold continues to press against your cabin walls, you begin to realize that survival isn't just about physical endurance, it's about mental resilience. The body, after all, can only go so far without rest, but the mind, too, has its breaking points. As much as you crave the comfort of sleep, there's another element to winter survival that can't be ignored: the mental strain of the season. The longer the cold lasts, the more your mind begins to fray. The isolation, the constant physical labor, and the ever-present hunger leave you feeling depleted in ways you hadn't anticipated. In these moments, sleep deprivation isn't just a physical challenge, it's a psychological one. You might find that concentration slips away, you lose track of time, your thoughts become erratic, and even the simplest of tasks can feel like monumental challenges. This is what historians have referred to as mental fatigue, an effect that's often exacerbated by the isolation of frontier life. The longer you go without a proper rest, the more difficult it becomes to hold on to your sanity. The isolation becomes more than just a nuisance. It becomes an oppressive force that lingers in the back of your mind. When you're fighting against exhaustion, your mental clarity suffers. It's not just about the physical exhaustion of chopping wood or hunting for food. It's the exhaustion of endless solitude. With only a few people to interact with and limited social stimulation, your mind begins to feel like it's stuck in a loop, running over the same thoughts again and again. Sometimes, you might even find yourself talking to yourself out loud just to break the silence, but even that can start to feel disorienting. The absence of external noise becomes overwhelming. It's almost as if your mind starts to become part of the cold, silent, still, and empty. To cope with the mental fatigue, many frontiersmen turned to mental exercises, things that could help break the monotony and engage their minds. Some would make up stories or pass time by whittling wood into shapes or carving tools. The act of creating something with their hands became a way to keep their minds sharp, to stave off the creeping fog of isolation. Others turned to journaling, writing down their thoughts, dreams, and daily struggles as a way of organizing the chaos in their minds. Even if these activities didn't provide the relief they needed to fully rest, they helped distract from the overwhelming sense of fatigue. But it's not just the isolation that makes mental resilience so important. There's also the need to stay positive. Every day you wake up to the same challenges, the same cold, and the same struggle for food and firewood. It would be easy to succumb to despair, to give in to the darkness that surrounds you. But frontiersmen had a way of persevering, of pushing through each day even when the next one seemed like it would be the same, full of hardship. And this mental fortitude became just as essential as physical strength. In the absence of comfort, the ability to find a sense of hope, to keep going despite everything, became a survival mechanism. It's easy to overlook the importance of mental health in such a situation, but in this context, it was just as critical as keeping the fire burning or ensuring that the cabin was secure. Sleep wasn't just a way to rest the body, it was a momentary escape from the mental exhaustion of the day. And when sleep was elusive, the mind had to find its own way to rest, whether through distraction, routine, or sheer willpower. Historians still debate the long-term effects of such mental strain on the frontiersmen. Some argue that the psychological toll of constant deprivation and isolation led to lasting effects, issues like depression or even early cognitive decline. Others suggest that the very resilience required to survive in such conditions helped these individuals adapt in ways we can't quite understand. In either case, there's no question that the mental challenge of frontier life was just as real and debilitating as the physical struggle. As you lie down tonight, think about the strength of the frontiersman's mind. Even when sleep evaded them, they still found a way to push through, to face each day, no matter how tough it was. When you think about your own struggles, whether with sleep or anything else, Remember how much can be accomplished by simply persisting, even when it feels like there's no end in sight. The frontier wasn't just about survival, it was about the quiet strength that comes from enduring the hardest of conditions, both physically and mentally. As winter deepens and the long, sleepless nights continue, there's a strange, paradoxical truth that emerges from the frontier's brutal conditions: the role of alcohol. Now, before you jump to conclusions, we're not talking about excessive drinking or the kind of wild revelry you might imagine. On the frontier, especially in the dead of winter, alcohol served a much more practical purpose. It was both a necessity and a coping mechanism. It was a way to stave off the cold, boost morale, and even, believe it or not, help you sleep. You see, in those days, alcohol wasn't just for celebration or relaxation. It was a tool for survival. Whether it was whiskey, brandy, or a homemade brew, alcohol had a way of warming you up from the inside, literally keeping the cold at bay. It wasn't just a comfort, it was a vital part of managing the harsh environment. For frontiersmen enduring endless snow and sub-zero temperatures, a few shots of liquor could make the difference between feeling like you were surviving and feeling like you were barely holding on. The warmth it provided was immediate, but it also offered a mental break from the relentless pressure of survival. But it wasn't just the physical warmth that alcohol provided. The frontier was lonely, and the isolation that accompanied it made every interaction feel like a rare event. A shared drink was often the way frontiersmen connected with each other. It was a way to break the silence of the long nights and exchange stories, however grim or boring they may have been. In fact, alcohol had a sort of ritualistic role. The act of pouring a drink, raising a glass, and toasting to survival became a small yet comforting tradition. It offered a sense of camaraderie, even in the dead of winter, when you were surrounded by little else but snow, wood, and the cold. The other benefit? Alcohol could sometimes help with sleep. While it wasn't a cure-all for sleep deprivation, a few sips of whiskey could help you relax enough to fall asleep, if only for a few hours. This was particularly crucial during those dark, cold nights when the silence of the wilderness felt suffocating. You could drown out the noise of your own thoughts with a few drinks and ease into a temporary state of rest, even if it wasn't a perfect or restorative sleep. The unfortunate truth, however, was that alcohol wasn't always a healthy solution. Too much drinking could lead to poor judgment, impaired decision-making, and eventually worse health outcomes. But in the desperate isolation of the frontier, it was often viewed as a necessary evil. Of course, historians still debate how widespread the use of alcohol was among frontiersmen during these years. Some believe that the frontier culture of alcohol consumption was much more casual, while others argue that it became a kind of crutch used to dull the pain of living in such harsh conditions. Either way, it's clear that alcohol played a significant role in shaping the sleep habits of settlers on the frontier. But in the end, it was more than just the warmth or the sleep aid that made alcohol so critical. It was the mental boost it provided. For frontiersmen, every sip reminded them that they weren't alone, that survival, while difficult, was possible. When the cold was unbearable, the work was endless, and sleep was elusive, alcohol became a little thread of comfort in an otherwise harsh world. It was a reminder of better days, of the possibility of joy amidst the suffering. As you settle in tonight, Imagine the relief that came with each shared drink, each fleeting moment of warmth in the freezing cold. Just as alcohol helped calm the nerves and ease the ache of hunger, sleep, in its own way, offers you a similar comfort, a brief escape from the challenges of the day. Tonight, as you rest, think of the frontiersmen who found small, fleeting joys in their difficult world, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they could close their eyes and find peace, if only for a little while. As the cold of winter continues to drag on, there comes a point when even the strongest among the frontiersmen begin to feel the toll of endless struggle. The cold, hunger, mental fatigue, and constant vigilance eventually catch up to everyone, even the most hardened survivors. And for those living on the frontier during these long winters, the concept of sleep begins to take on a deeper, more profound meaning. Sleep, once a simple physical necessity, now becomes a means of escape from the relentless cold, the isolation, and the grinding daily battle for survival. For many frontiersmen, sleep is a shared experience, not just a solitary retreat from the world. Families, even entire communities, would gather together in the same room, huddling for warmth. When the cold seemed unbearable, the human need for connection became just as important as the need for rest. Shared beds or sleeping near the fire was a common practice, as it provided warmth, but also something more subtle, a sense of solidarity. In the midst of the harshest conditions, the presence of others provided comfort, even if it was just a brief moment of togetherness before drifting off to sleep. However, this shared sleep came with its own set of complications. While the warmth of body heat helped ease the chill, the close proximity of others could make sleep more difficult. The constant shift in movement, the sound of someone else's breathing, or the need to stay quiet and still in such close quarters could prevent the deeper stages of sleep. But for the frontiersmen, it was a necessary compromise. The alternative, sleeping alone in a cold, dark cabin, was far more frightening than any minor discomfort caused by sharing a bed with family members or fellow settlers. The mental challenge of shared sleep in such a tiny, crowded space, however, was often underestimated. The lack of personal space had a profound impact on everyone. It was one thing to have a small cabin for a family, but it was another entirely when multiple families were forced to share that space. The noise of sleeping children, the shifting of bodies, and the inevitable disagreements that arose from living in such cramped conditions only added to the stress. But even with all the noise and disturbance, the fact that everyone was together was crucial. The human need for connection was far stronger than the occasional discomfort that came with sharing such close quarters. Interestingly, these shared sleeping arrangements were not just about physical warmth, but also about mental warmth. The constant presence of others, even in the stillness of winter, gave settlers a sense of comfort that was hard to come by in such a remote and lonely environment. Shared stories, even simple conversations, became a lifeline. A tale from the past, a joke about the hardships of frontier life, or just the sound of someone else's voice in the dead of night could make all the difference when sleep was hard to find. It wasn't about the quality of sleep, but the comfort in knowing that you weren't alone in the struggle. Of course, this kind of shared living arrangement wasn't without its complications. You can imagine the frustration of trying to get some sleep when the entire cabin was bustling with activity. Parents trying to sleep while children cried, or neighbors discuss the next day's work could easily turn into an overwhelming experience. Sleep deprivation could strain relationships and create tensions. But on the frontier, the act of surviving together became more important than the perfect night's sleep. Each individual knew that they had to contribute to the overall success of the group, and the shared experience of enduring the winter together meant that no one was left behind. Historians often discuss how this communal aspect of frontier life affected people's mental health and sleep cycles. Some suggest that the constant presence of others created a sense of security that allowed settlers to rest in ways they couldn't if they were alone. Others, however, argue that the lack of privacy and constant disruption made sleep harder to come by. The question remains, how did these shared experiences impact overall health? Were frontiersmen and women more resilient because they had each other? Or was the constant strain of being packed into tight spaces with little respite actually detrimental to their health? So, as you lie in your own bed tonight, think of the frontiersmen and their shared sleep. Even when rest was hard to come by, they knew that sticking together was their best chance at survival. Tonight, as you close your eyes, you might find comfort in the thought that you're not alone in your journey, just like they weren't, bundled up together, waiting for the light of spring to return. As you lay there in the quiet of the night, tucked into your blankets, the cold and the silence pressing in, you may start to wonder, what is it like to sleep with the constant threat of wildlife just outside your door? The frontier wasn't just harsh because of the cold, the isolation, or the scarcity of food. It was harsh because of the dangers that waited just beyond the safety of the cabin. The very thought of being vulnerable to the forces of nature, wild animals, storms, and even the occasional hostile settler kept many frontiersmen from sleeping soundly through the night. You can almost hear the wolves howling in the distance, or maybe you're worried about the bears that might be prowling the woods looking for food. For some frontiersmen, the constant threat of wildlife wasn't just a mental strain, it was a physical one. Animals like bears or cougars could easily make their way into a cabin during the night if the door or window wasn't secured. Even smaller threats, like raccoons or opossums, could cause plenty of noise, frightening the settlers into a state of constant alertness. This vigilance, combined with the usual sleep deprivation of the winter months, meant that sleep was often fragmented, interrupted, or flat out impossible. Historians still debate whether the wildlife threats were exaggerated, but those who lived through the winters on the frontier knew better. These dangers were a constant, not just because of the animals themselves, but because of how they disrupted your rest. The fact that animals were actively hunting in the woods, whether for food or out of instinct, made every rustling sound feel dangerous. You could never quite let your guard down, and in the deepest part of winter, when the cold makes you feel trapped inside, this became a much more terrifying reality. You can imagine the exhaustion that comes from a long, sleepless night, when every sound has you up on your feet, checking the doors and windows to make sure everything is secure. But it wasn't just the fear of wildlife that kept people awake. The bears, wolves, and other predators weren't the only threats to safety. The frontier was a wild and unpredictable place, where even neighbors could become adversaries in the dead of winter. Sometimes, a hostile settler or a group of outlaws would roam the area, looking for supplies or causing trouble. These intruders could appear without warning, And with the isolation of frontier cabins, you could be left alone, defenseless, until help arrived, if help ever came at all. This constant fear, this mental toll, was just another layer to the already exhausting experience of frontier life. But it was also another reason why sleep became so valuable and so elusive. When you're on edge all night, whether because of wild animals or the looming uncertainty of the next day's survival, sleep feels like it's always just beyond your grasp. It's not that you don't need it, it's that your mind refuses to rest when there's so much danger lurking just outside. The most unsettling part of it all was the constant mental fatigue that comes from living in this way. You might lie down, exhausted, trying to escape the cold and the fear, but your mind keeps working. What if that snap of a branch means something? What if the wolves are getting closer? The knowledge that you need to sleep to function tomorrow, but the deep-set anxiety that keeps you from doing so, creates a cycle that's incredibly difficult to break. Despite all this, the human spirit has a way of adapting. With time, the constant vigilance became second nature. You might start to hear those same sounds, wolves in the distance or the wind howling through the trees, and they wouldn't disturb you as much. Your senses would sharpen. You'd start to recognize the difference between a bear in the distance and a simple branch snapping. You'd learn to identify when you truly needed to be awake and when it was okay to let your body take a rest. But even so, there was always something unnerving about sleeping with one eye open, the idea that no matter how badly you needed rest, you had to be ready for the worst. And when spring finally arrived, and the threat of predators and the long, sleepless nights faded away, you might find that the peaceful sleep you dreamed of through the cold winter was finally within your grasp. But the struggle to survive, to fight off exhaustion, hunger, and danger, was something that would stay with you forever, an enduring memory of life on the frontier. So, as you close your eyes tonight, think of those settlers tucked into their cabins, barely sleeping, constantly aware of the dangers that might be just outside. It's easy to take the safety of your modern world for granted, but the frontiersmen's vigilance was as necessary to survival as the fire they kept burning. Sleep, in these moments, wasn't just a relief, it was a delicate balance between safety and risk, comfort and danger. As the harsh winter months start to soften with the first hints of spring, there's a certain relief in the air. But even as the days get longer, the toll that winter has taken on the frontiersmen's bodies and minds doesn't fade overnight. The weariness of surviving through long, sleepless winters becomes a lingering presence, one that doesn't simply vanish with the thawing of the snow. The physical toll is obvious: stiff muscles, weakened immunity, and an ongoing battle with fatigue. But it's the mental strain that may prove even more enduring. You see, when the body is deprived of rest for such long stretches, it can take far longer to recover. The effects of sleep deprivation often extend well beyond the winter months, and as spring slowly comes into view, the frontiersmen still feel the lingering effects of the endless battle for survival. Sleep becomes more important than ever, but it's still hard to come by. The idea that sleeping during the winter months was a temporary fix to a much bigger issue becomes painfully clear. The body, having gone through such rigorous exertion, still needs time to heal. One of the first signs that winter's toll is being felt is the recovery period. There's a sense of needing to catch up, to make up for the weeks of sleeplessness that came with the harsh conditions. Spring offers the promise of longer, warmer days, but the rhythms of life have been disrupted. The shift from the cold, harsh winter to the slow warm-up of spring doesn't immediately grant frontiersmen a full return to health. In fact, it takes weeks, sometimes months, for their sleep schedules to normalize. They might even find that their bodies are out of sync with the changing seasons, and it becomes a challenge to reestablish a routine. However, one of the most interesting aspects of this transition is the way the mind responds to the end of the isolation and the return of social interaction. During the winter, sleep was often disturbed by isolation and the need to stay vigilant. But with the return of spring and the promise of more daylight comes the opportunity to reconnect with others, and this can bring a sense of emotional relief that helps facilitate better sleep. Now, the isolation is broken, and the social bonds that are formed during the earlier months can make a huge difference in the recovery of sleep quality. The return of community means a return to normal rhythms, and the social interaction that was missing during the winter months offers a mental reprieve that directly affects the quality of rest. The mental recovery is key. As the weather warms and the sense of threat from animals or intruders lessens, the frontiersmen begin to find a sense of calm. It's not just about the lack of danger, it's about the return of normalcy. As the daily grind of winter subsides, the burden on the mind lessens, and with it comes the luxury of sleep, the kind that's not interrupted by fears of wildlife or the constant pressure of survival. For the first time in months, they can rest fully without that nagging feeling of needing to be alert at any moment. It's also during this period of recovery that many frontiersmen would experience their first true moments of relaxation in months. The weight of constant vigilance is lifted, and the routines of the harsh winter give way to the natural rhythms of life. As the land begins to thaw and the promise of food and warmth grows, the rest they so desperately needed becomes possible. However, this recovery period isn't immediate, it's a gradual process. The first nights of truly uninterrupted sleep are often met with a sense of unease, as if the mind is still wary, still attuned to the dangers of the long winter. It takes time for the body to trust that it can truly rest without the constant fear of waking to a new threat. But slowly, over time, the sleep cycles stabilize, and the frontiersmen, finally, can feel the full restorative effects of their much-needed sleep. Historians often highlight the importance of sleep recovery after long periods of deprivation. It's believed that, like muscle recovery after strenuous exercise, the mind and body need to regenerate and reset before returning to peak performance. Sleep isn't just about getting enough hours. It's about giving the body and mind the space to heal. This recovery time, often lasting weeks or even months, was just as vital to the frontiersmen as the original work and endurance required to survive the winter. Without proper rest and recovery, they wouldn't be able to face the new challenges spring would bring. Tonight, as you rest, consider how rest and recovery are as vital as work itself. Just as the frontiersmen had to endure hardships to reach the spring, you too might find that the hardest parts of your day are often the ones that lead to the deepest, most rewarding rest. As you sleep tonight, imagine the warmth of recovery, the return of normalcy, and the slow healing process that sleep brings to the body and mind. Finally, after months of braving the harsh winter, the frontiersman stands at the threshold of spring, exhausted but triumphant. The worst of the cold, hunger, and isolation has passed, But it's important to recognize that the toll on the body, mind, and sleep habits doesn't vanish with the first signs of warmth. The recovery from those long sleepless months on the frontier is a gradual, often painful process. For the first time in what feels like forever, the days are longer and the sun rises earlier, bringing a new rhythm to the day, and with it, a sense of normalcy that's been missing for so long. The transition from winter to spring brings a strange sense of relief, but also a wave of physical and mental fatigue. The winter months didn't just take a toll on sleep, it wore down every part of the body. Your muscles ache from the constant struggle against the cold. Your mind is frazzled from the endless cycle of stress and isolation, and the sleep you did manage to get never felt like enough. So now, with spring unfolding in front of you, you begin the process of catching up on both sleep and strength. The first days of spring are often filled with the sounds of nature reawakening, the chirping of birds, the rustling of trees in the soft wind, and the first signs of life that promise an end to the long winter. These sounds bring a sense of comfort that hadn't been there for months, and for the first time in what feels like forever, you can let your guard down. The vigilance that kept you awake during the winter months, the constant need to be aware of dangers lurking in the night, is no longer as pressing. The land is thawing, and with it a sense of peace that allows you to finally rest deeply. However, this isn't a perfect transition. The need for work in the spring, with planting crops, gathering supplies, and preparing for the growing season, means that there's still little time for rest. You're still physically drained from the winter, and the tasks ahead are formidable. Even though the mental burden of isolation has lifted and the weather is kinder, your body still struggles to find its rhythm. There's a sense of needing to catch up, not just with sleep, but with the balance of life. Every moment of rest is precious, yet often interrupted by the necessity of spring chores. But there is something soothing in the rhythm of life returning to normal, in the warmth of the sun on your skin after months of harsh cold, and in the small victories, like a full meal after weeks of hunger, or a full night's sleep without waking to check for predators. These small moments of comfort are part of the healing process, even though it takes time to recover from months of sleep deprivation. The recovery period becomes a powerful reminder of what the human body is capable of. Sleep, after all, is a form of healing. And in the same way that your body slowly recovers from the physical toll of the winter months, your mind begins to heal as well. The mental clarity that was lost during the long, sleepless nights starts to return, and the stress of the winter months begins to feel like a distant memory. You might still wake up occasionally in the middle of the night, still feeling the faint stirrings of anxiety or the remnants of hunger, but these are less frequent now. The battle for survival is over, and a new chapter has begun, one where rest is finally becoming a true luxury once again. Looking back, you realize that sleep wasn't just about the lack of rest during those long winters. It was about the strength that came from enduring the hardship, the ability to adapt in the most extreme conditions. The frontiersman story isn't just one of surviving winter. It's about finding a way to persist, to continue on despite the mental and physical exhaustion. And now, as you lay down tonight, imagine the deep sleep that will come in the warmth of spring, knowing that the fight for rest is finally over. The land has thawed, and the promise of recovery is on the horizon. Rest well tonight, knowing that, like the frontiersmen of old, you've made it through your own struggles, and in the quiet of sleep, you too will find restoration. And just as the earth comes back to life in spring, so too can the body, mind, and spirit after a long, difficult season.